Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Each month we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee. That's everything from a 20th to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Eric Martin, creator and moderator of the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that meets weekly in the Chicagoland area. Well, I just mentioned that we feat all the way up to a centennial, and sure enough, that's what we'll be doing this month, putting a whopping 100 candles on the cake for a movie that many regard as the first real horror film that mattered, an all-time work of world cinema and one of the most influential flicks ever made. It's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, directed by Robert Wiene, and originally released in Germany way back in 1920. Now, this is a pretty important picture, so I wanted to be sure to secure the best guest possible, and sure enough, I landed one of the most knowledgeable Caligari experts around. Kristin Thompson, a renowned film theorist, scholar, and past professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who co-authored with her husband David Bordwell two of the most seminal film studies texts ever written, Film Art and Film History. She also crafted an essay on The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari that appeared in the restored edition of the film, issued on DVD and Blu-ray by Kino Lorber in 2014. Kristin and I will travel up the crooked streets and round the askew corners of this nightmarish world as we attempt to examine why this film is worth celebrating all these years later, its cultural impact and legacy, what we can learn from the picture today, how it stood the test of time, and more. But prior to descending into the dreamlike world of German Expressionism, let's take a moment to get up to speed on when, where, and why Caligari was made, per Wikipedia. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a 1920 German silent horror film directed by Robert Wiene and written by Hans Janowitz and Karl Mayr. Considered the quintessential work of German Expressionist cinema, it tells the story of an insane hypnotist, played by Werner Krauss, who uses a somnambulist named Cesare, portrayed by Conrad Veidt, to commit murders. The film features a dark and twisted visual style with sharp-pointed forms, oblique and curving lines, structures and landscapes that lean and twist in unusual angles, and shadows and streaks of light painted directly onto the sets. The script was inspired by various experiences from the lives of Janowitz and Mayr, both pacifists who were left distrustful of authority after their experiences with the military during World War I. The movie makes use of a frame story with a prologue and twist-ending epilogue. And the design of the picture was handled by Hermann Worm, Walter Reinmann, and Walter Ruhrig, who recommended a fantastic graphic style over a naturalistic one. Writers and scholars like Siegfried Kracauer have argued that the film thematizes brutal and irrational authority. Caligari represents the German war government, and Cesare is symbolic of the common man, conditioned like soldiers to kill. Kracauer and others contend that the film reflects a subconscious need in German society for a tyrant, and is an example of Germany's obedience to authority and unwillingness to rebel against deranged authority. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari made its theatrical debut in Germany on February 26, 1920. It currently holds a perfect 100% fresh score on Rotten Tomatoes and an average critical score of 9.28 out of 10. Now, apparently an original trailer doesn't technically exist for a film this old, but let's lend an ear to Kino Lorber's 2014 re-release trailer of Caligari, which features a really atmospheric score used for the restored edition of the film. right, if you've been listening long enough to this Cineversary podcast, you know the drill. I'm about to warn you that spoilers are ahead. And seriously, this movie has a pretty cool plot twist. So if you've not yet screened Caligari, put this podcast on hold, do your duty as a self-respecting film fan, and go watch the movie already. You can actually view the complete 2014 restored version on YouTube if you go to tinyurl.com/Caligari20. And it's only 77 minutes long, so it's a pretty quick watch. We'll wait. Okay, you're back. Great. Without further delay, let's raise the curtain on our distinguished guest, Kristin Thompson. So welcome, Kristin Thompson. I'm so thrilled to have you as a guest on Cineversary. I remember seeing your name on the front of the first real film studies book I ever read, Film Art, which you co-authored with your husband, David Bordwell. And this was the first book listed on the syllabus for the initial film studies class I took in college. And I have to tell you, it made a huge impression on me. And you also contributed a great essay to the Kino Lorber Blu-ray edition of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which I own, and the essay of which I read with relish. It was great. So it's a real treat to be speaking with you.
Well, thank you. It's a treat to be here, and it's always good to hear from a student who has been inspired in some way by the book.
This should be fun. Let's dig deeper into one of the most important movies of all time. So when and where did you first see The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari? And tell me why the movie is important to you, Kristin.
Well, I was in college at the time. I was an undergrad, majoring in theater, actually. I had never considered taking a film course, but looking around for an elective during my junior year, I ran across a history of film class. It was the only thing that fit into my schedule, so I took it, and that's where I first saw Caligari and other films, early films that impressed me as well, films of Georges Méliès. And it really was a revelation to me because when I was in high school, I went to local art houses and saw, sort of what one might consider kind of easy art films like Zorba the Greek and Marriage Italian Style, old Alec Guinness comedies, that kind of thing. And that was sort of my idea of art cinema.
Okay.
But then when I saw things like the Méliès films and Caligari, I realized there must be a vast range of films out there that are nothing like what I was used to.
Right.
And so Caligari really gave me that idea that there was a lot out there to explore, and that in many cases, these films would be very different from what I was used to. And it appealed to me because I think I tend to like stylized films a bit better than realistic films on the whole.
Interesting. Okay.
So the style of the film attracted me a lot, and that really, in a way, diverted me from my interest in theater, and I ended up in film studies within a couple of years, going to graduate school and studying all kinds of cinema by that point.
Are you saying that the watching of Caligari by itself, or maybe in conjunction with some other films, is what led you to pursue film over theater?
Well, I think it really does go back to that. I mean, I saw, of course, quite a few other kinds of films in that class, but it was Caligari that really sort of struck my imagination. And
wow.
Well, basically, my senior year, I took a few more film courses and decided to apply for grad school. This was at the University of Iowa.
You can't speak higher praise than that. We can be thankful then that Caligari was so inspirational in your life, it sounds like.
Yeah. Oh, I look back on it with great fondness. I still like it very much.
Yeah, I got to tell you, for my part, I actually didn't see the movie in its entirety until about 10 years ago. I was exposed to clips in film studies classes, but it wasn't until relatively recently, Kristin, that I watched it all the way through with fresh eyes. And to be honest, I found it hard to enjoy on that first watch way back when. I kind of admired it like a work of modern abstract art that hangs in a museum, but which you can't really understand. I mean, you respect the fact that it's regarded as important, but you don't quite understand why. So it wasn't until actually last year when I looked on the movie with fresh eyes and a deeper perspective that I saw it for the masterwork it is. And being a huge fan of fright films, I can see now how it's rightfully considered as kind of the granddaddy of all horror movies and a major influence on that genre in particular.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to get into those influences in just a moment. But let me ask you first, why is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari worth celebrating 100 years later? Why does it still matter, Kristin, and how has it stood the test of time?
Well, there's the obvious fact that it was the film that started the German Expressionist movement, so historically it's something you can't really overlook. That was a very important avant-garde film movement of the silent period, and there isn't anything like Caligari before that. It really started that movement. And as you just mentioned, I think it's very important in the development of the horror film, too. I mean, I think most horror buffs know Caligari well, and other German films of that era like Waxworks and Nosferatu. So it was an important genre film at the time.
No question.
I think the only earlier horror film that anyone sees from Germany or from any country really is The Student of Prague from 1913. So maybe that's the great granddaddy of the horror film. But Caligari is important in a major stylistic movement and in a genre. And I've always found it entertaining as well. It's maybe you were put off the first time you saw it, but from the start, I just thought it was a good story, well told, apart from the style.
Absolutely. It was the story that captivated me so much this last viewing, and I was kind of kicking myself, why didn't I pay more attention to the story initially? I think I was kind of distracted by the two-dimensional, strange, slanted sets and weird kind of colors and so forth that I kind of missed the forest for the trees, if you will, and now that story really is quite riveting to me.
Those are, I guess, the main reasons I think it's still worth looking at.
We can agree. It's a timeless work of artistry, imagination, creativity, proved highly influential. We're going to talk about the influences in a moment as well, but it's also very well preserved for being a 100-year-old film, at least the version on Kino Blu-ray.
Yeah.
And that speaks to the care and attention it has received as a lasting masterpiece of world cinema. I mean, unfortunately, let's face it, so many of these classics from, yesteryear are not well preserved, and we have to kind of endure the best available prints and so forth. But Caligari actually looks really good, and I was very impressed just with the presentation and the visuals, at least on home video.
Yeah, it's a much better print than what I saw when I first watched it. I mean, in class it was shown on 16 millimeter, and it was an okay print, but it wasn't nearly as good as the one we have now. And in fact, I had seen it a number of times since, and it's always been the same old print. And I do think the restoration is very good.
Fantastic.
They had, I guess, some sort of a original negative or duplicate negative to work from, and they did a good job.
Yeah, that makes a big difference, absolutely. I think it's also fun to trace this movie's inspirations and influences, to examine the film and imagine how future filmmakers would have been motivated to emulate the look and the feel and the design of this film and its characters. I also think it's fascinating upon further, research on my own and so forth. I'm sure you can elaborate on this if you care to, but it's fascinating to explore the political underpinnings of this movie, the statements it made about Germany and its people at the time of its release, and the subtextual commentary about the future of post-World War I Germany. What do you think about that?
Well, I was brought up on Krakauer's book. I mean, that was the book we read in the class I took. Siegfried Krakauer, From Caligari to Hitler, and I don't buy it, frankly. I think it was already a genre in Germany before the 20s. I mean, the horror genre, there are a lot of obscure and lost horror films from the teens in Germany that people never see, although some of them are now being revived. Richard Oswald's Unheimliche Geschichte, for example, from 1919, which is a kind of portmanteau film about various villains, little, embedded stories.
Okay.
But that was just shown in Bologna this year at Il Cinema Ritrovato, the Festival of Restored Films. So some of these films are getting out now. But the horror element that's in Caligari was already there through the teens in German films. So Weimar cinema didn't exist at that point. So if this is already going on, I'm not sure this is something you can say is, reflective or prescient about what's going to happen to Germany a decade later.
I guess it was kind of controversial at the time and may still be, but it's one way of looking at the movie, and it's an interesting discussion point, if nothing else.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Krakauer is still read, certainly.
So let's get a little deeper here. In what ways do you think Caligari was influential on film and popular culture, or set trends in any way?
It has been sort of imitated occasionally throughout film history. I mean, I think of something like the Universal horror films of the 30s,
Sure.
and particularly Son of Frankenstein from 1939 has some very expressionist sets in it.
Yeah, how about, of course, the original Frankenstein, but also Murders in the Rue Morgue, which I saw recently, has some kind of expressionistic-looking sets there.
Yeah.
The Man Who Laughs, which is another Universal horror film often forgotten about. So many of these, The Black Cat, The Mummy, Dracula to some extent. But yes, absolutely, Son of Frankenstein, right? I mean, you see it right there in the architectural aesthetics.
Yeah, but then something like Beetlejuice. I mean, that's
Yes.
got some pretty directly expressionistic sets in it. So
You could have a lot of fun with Tim Burton movies. And how
Yeah.
he was certainly a student of this movie, right?
yeah, and Frankenweenie, the longer version.
Right.
Yeah, so yeah, Tim Burton obviously knew these films.
I don't know if you've ever seen the second Batman movie he did. I think it's Batman Returns, but just the look of the Penguin, as played by Danny DeVito. I mean, I mean, he's obviously aping Dr. Caligari himself in the actual costuming and so forth. And it's just one small example. I mean, there's Edward Scissorhands, there's The Nightmare Before Christmas. Tim Burton is certainly a devotee of this film.
And then there's film noir from the 30s and 40s, where you don't get the distortion in the sets, but they really quite often use the lighting to create the same kinds of patterns and distortions in the mise-en-scène.
Can you cite a particular film noir that you think is a good example of, you could directly see Caligari's influence, or is it just the entire genre?
I think it's the genre because, of course, a lot of those films were directed by German emigres who would have known these films thoroughly.
True.
And you look at something like Double Indemnity, which only has a few scenes with these kinds of lighting patterns, but it's pretty dramatic, and that's Billy Wilder. So I do think there's a sort of transformative influence there where it doesn't look exactly like the expressionist cinema, but it has the same feel about it in a way.
Yeah, I mean, Roger Ebert came out and he said he thinks this is the actual true first horror movie. What do you think? You had mentioned The Student of Prague, or maybe some earlier influences. To what regard do you give this film its props as a major influence on horror movies? Is it the first real horror movie, or what would you counter to that?
As far as I know, The Student of Prague is the first horror movie in Germany. I mean, there was a version of Frankenstein made in 1910, I think, in the States.
Yeah, the Edison Company.
Yeah, but it's very early, that's for sure. And then you get other films starring Paul Wegener, who was very interested in using cinema for doing fairy stories and horror films and so on. So he made a version of Der Golem in the mid-teens, and unfortunately that one's lost. But of course we have the Der Golem from 1920. So yeah, there was this genre already existing, and I just wish more of the films were known, although I must say they're not as good as Caligari, but there were films lost and now just hidden away in archives that were precedents for Caligari, but it obviously made such a splash internationally that it had much more influence on the genre as it developed later.
I wanted to ask you, too, about some of the horror tropes and conventions that Caligari advances, and that I see, at least, echoed in later movies. So to give you an example, the mad scientist in his experiment. Now, this may not have been the first instance of that in a motion picture, but it's picked up later in Frankenstein, right?
Sure.
You've got Beauty and the Beast as a trope or convention. So instead of killing the girl, Cesare falls in love with her and carries her away, much like King Kong does in that movie.
Yeah.
You've got like the monster on the loose threatening the community, as you see later in The Wolfman or in Frankenstein, for example. Here's an instance of the nocturnal fiend who must return to his resting place before dawn. Now, this didn't invent a vampire story, but you see it echoed in Dracula or The Wolfman. And then later, we get zombie movies. We get the Living Dead kind of trope in Night of the Living Dead, and I think there's some of this echoed in that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the serial killer, the slasher film, you would see later in The Lodger or The Leopard Man or, of course, Psycho. And then, too, the thriller with a shock twist ending, as evidenced in Psycho and Diabolique. Can you think of any other conventions or tropes that Caligari might have kind of ushered in?
Well, I'm not as much an expert as you are on that. I think you've covered it. It's interesting that there's a little bit of the police procedural that creeps in as well.
Yeah, that's true.
It's odd that you get total access to what's going on. There are no mysteries withheld from the audience, so we know what Caligari knows, and we know what the police know. And we watch the police try to find out what we already know, that it's Caligari.
And I could see how this would have been kind of echoed later in M, just a few years later, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the police procedural details you're giving there, the knowledge that the filmmakers give to the audience.
Combined with the serial killer plot, and and the fact that we do know so much about what's happening in that film as well.
I also read that Caligari is regarded as the first movie to provide a subjective simulation of events shown. So instead of going for realism, as most movies had up to this point, Caligari presents an emotionally abstract, skewed, slanted, and personalized point of view. Is that an accurate assigning of credit?
I think the idea that the whole story is done subjectively was probably new. It's always dangerous to say because so many silent films are lost.
True.
But before this, most of the time when you get something subjective, it's in very early cinema, there'll be a dream or a thought superimposed up in the corner very briefly, and so you know what the character is thinking or dreaming, and you get vision scenes. But they're usually pretty brief. So, yeah, Caligari does something new there, I think. There was, in general, an exploration of subjectivity among filmmakers in the 20s, especially in France. And those films aren't as well known, but French Impressionism explored all sorts of ways of conveying subjectivity, mostly through camera work and editing rather than mise-en-scène. But, yeah, subjective portrayals became a thing in the 20s, I think.
I mean, it's hard to imagine a film without a subjective point of view today, but there was a time where you didn't have that. And so, this would have been, if not the instrumental movie, then one of them in the early days that kind of introduced this concept. Instead of going for realism, kind of that emotionally abstract kind of approach.
Absolutely.
I like to explore themes and messages in film, Kristin, kind of the moral to the story, if you will. I wanted to share a few that I've come up with and read about from Caligari, and then maybe get your thoughts.
Okay.
One of them that stands out is gullibility and naivete. Now, I know some of this falls in with Krakauer's theory, which you've already expressed you don't necessarily agree with, but just hear me out here. So the film, to me, serves as a metaphor for the German nation and its people after losing World War I. Caligari, to me anyway, represents the German government and its war machine kind of embodied in a puppet master who can control his subject, Cesare, a stand-in for the sleepwalking populace who easily fell under the spell and false promises of German leaders and who were, as soldiers, brainwashed into being mindless killers in World War I. So what do you think about that? Does that hold any water for you?
Frankly, it doesn't. Again, I go back to the fact that there is a whole tradition of this sort of thing, this kind of story, this mad scientist or mad hypnotist or whatever, the puppet master, going back to E.T.A. Hoffman and his sort of fantasy horror stories. And I just see it as more a German tradition in general, the whole idea of the doppelganger plot. And it seems to me to far precede the political goings-on during the World War I period and the 1920s.
Now, I thought I read, though, that the authors of Caligari, I think they were veterans of World War I, or they returned kind of embittered from that experience, and that was part of their motivation for writing the story. In any event, I didn't come up with this on my own. I was looking up some different theories about it. Another theme is maybe the thin line between sanity and insanity and the subjective nature of reality. So everything we see in the film is questionable once we learn that the narrator, Francis, is himself a lunatic in the asylum. His testimony is now unreliable, and the man we thought was murderously mad, Dr. Caligari, is actually the asylum director, which to me promotes an ironic message that it's the inmates running the asylum. What do you think about this possible theme?
Well, certainly people have pointed out that Dr. Caligari doesn't look all that benevolent in that final scene where he says, now I know how to cure him. He's looking rather diabolical. But so that I can see that could fit in with what the film prompts you to think in that final moment especially when it irises in on his face as the film is ending and then just pauses on it without completing the iris in until
Right.
you've had a good chance to look at that diabolical face. So I think there probably is some play with, as you say, the boundary between madness and sanity, which is
Sure.
such a theme that runs through so many horror films.
Oh, absolutely. Right, right. It's fun. You can have a lot of fun with this, too. But another theme to me is duality, the dual nature of human beings. And the evidence of this is you think about how Caligari has two sides. He's a respected leader of a mental institution in at least the framing story, but he's also a crazy manipulator in the main story.
Mm-hmm.
And then Cesare, he can be seen as both a perpetrator and a victim, as both a heartless monster and a man who falls in love with the woman he intended to kill.
Sure.
He's not necessarily a sympathetic figure, but maybe he is. I mean, if he's being puppeteered against his will, then maybe he is more sympathetic. And then you have Francis. He's somebody who appears as this heroic protagonist who seeks the truth and learns Caligari's dark secret, and yet he proves to be a mental patient. Duality at play again.
Yeah.
And you even look at something like the actual fair. It has both a light and a fun side, as well as a dark and a dangerous side once, of course, the doctor is introduced.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any other duality at work in Caligari?
I can't think of any either. There really aren't that many characters, and clearly Jane and Alan are not portrayed that way. So I guess you've covered it. Yeah, it's clearly a real thing. As you say, they have Caligari and Cesare both are disguised in some way and leading double lives. And there is the frame story.
And I want to get into that. That's a good segue. So what's your opinion of the framing story, Kristin, the prologue and the epilogue? Does it dilute the message, as some critics have argued, or does it take Caligari to a whole new level?
I think it's a benefit to the film. On the one hand, you can argue it kind of waters down the style of the film because it makes it motivated through some sort of a quasi-realistic reason. You know, this guy is crazy and therefore this is the way the world is seen. But I don't know, I think it gives it a certain depth. And, you know, if you've got the duality you were just talking about, then that's partly where it comes from. I think it was a benefit to the film.
Yeah, I agree. I love it because I'm a fan of twist endings when they're done well, and you know, like this one is. And films that stimulate further questions and thought, it just adds a whole new level to me, a depth and dimension. And the picture raises so many questions by the end. Again, this is part of the intrigue of Caligari to me, is it leaves you with unanswered questions. And I like movies that challenge you to think beyond when the credits have rolled and you're leaving the theater. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. The framing story works for me. Now, it's hard not to notice some wrinkles in a century-old picture, of course, but are there any elements from Caligari that maybe have aged better than expected, in your opinion? I mean, it's 100 years old, so if you want to look for flaws, there are going to be some visual, technical kind of, imperfections, and maybe the acting is histrionic, etc. But I don't even think it's fair to, pick apart a 100-year-old film in that way. But how about the other approach? What elements have aged better than you thought?
I, in a way, don't think it has aged all that much because I can imagine people today coming to it, as you did, and enjoying it thoroughly, whether it's on the first viewing or second viewing or whatever. But I think it's an entertaining film, and I would imagine people would be intrigued by it. So I think it's compared to a lot of the German films that were made in that period, it holds up extremely well. I think a lot of people who get a chance to see very many German films from the 20s will think quite a few of them are kind of slow and boring. I happen to like that, but many would not. I think it holds up because it is still entertaining to people and still intriguing. The style is unusual enough. It wasn't widely imitated enough that it seems old hat. I must say, I'm so used to looking at old films in their original context as much as possible that I find it kind of hard to get that kind of distance on it and think, oh, well, it looks old-fashioned because they were using these rather clunky arc lights to light the sets. And let's face it, the painted scenery does literally show wrinkles. This was a very cheaply made film, even though it has people who were big stars at the time in it. I mean, Werner Krauss and Conrad Veidt and Will Dagover were all major stars, and here they are all in this film doing expressionistic acting, and I just don't think of it as having aged. But then, on the other hand, I have to say that the first time I saw the film, as I mentioned, it was in the spring semester of my junior year. That was the 50th anniversary of this film.
Wow.
I don't have too much problem looking back and thinking, okay, in this context, in which this film was made. It looks fine for its period, and it's interesting and it's original. It's innovative.
But it's almost above criticism to me because, again, while it has influenced and inspired so many later movies, as we've already talked about, there really is no other film like it. It's really hard to kind of draw a comparison to any other movie because it's so unique and one of a kind. Do you agree?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And I don't know, I have a great deal of patience with the very old films. So I'm not sure how the majority of people would respond to it and maybe think it looks old-fashioned, but it doesn't look old-fashioned to me.
The two-dimensionality and the cheapness of the sets, for example, to me, almost seem like it's so surreal and dreamlike that there's nothing really to compare it to. While we've seen echoes of it in later movies, it almost strikes me as it's so completely distinctive, you can't, as I said, compare it to anything else. So how can you really criticize it? I mean, if you wanted to poke holes and say, like you said, it was made very cheaply, they could have spent more time on the sets, etc., it defeats the purpose because, again, if it's German expressionism and they're not trying to look realistic, this is the exact right approach. It's so completely its own animal, Dr. Caligari.
Yeah.
It has this coolness of aesthetic that it's beyond reproach or criticism.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's unique. Even though there were other expressionist films, they aren't really like Caligari, except occasionally in some superficial ways.
Have you ever seen a movie from Germany or any other country in this time period here where they're doing sets like this?
There's von Morgen's Bis Mitternacht. There's Wiener's Raskolnikov from 1923. But these films are very hard to see still. They're not among the films that have been circulated much in recent times. But I've gone to archives to watch them, and I think I've seen all the surviving expressionist films. And there are some, but even so, their stories are very different. Well, they aren't like Caligari.
Sure. You mentioned a moment ago that it was made kind of on the cheap. Do you have any details about that? Now, I'm not putting you on the spot asking you to name budget numbers per se, but for example, did they deliberately go inexpensive because they knew they were going to use these cheaper looking two-dimensional kind of backdrops and so forth? Or was it a function of, hey, we only have so much money, so we have to make them inexpensively?
Well, I think partly it was the fact that Germany was very isolated at this period. And Germany had never had a very strong film industry. Their local market before the war was dominated by French and Italian and American films.
Okay.
Their industry was just not very well developed. And after the war, they were being boycotted right and left by foreign countries that had fought against them. I mean, the French had a 15-year boycott on showing any German films.
Is that right?
Similar, although less draconian, boycotts were in effect in England and the United States. So they didn't have a very big market for their films. I mean, they could show in Germany and some places in Central Europe and so on, but they didn't have the resources that other national industries did. And so, making a film like Caligari was probably not all that unusual, saving money on sets and so forth. But it was clearly a gamble of sorts to make an expressionist film. And they probably didn't want to put huge resources into it.
Okay.
We don't know the budget of the film or anything like that. It certainly, once it came out in the United States, people were estimating it would have cost about $18,000 to make in America.
Interesting.
Which is very small even for those days, because even adjusting for inflation, but the films in Hollywood were made in the hundreds of thousands of dollars in those days.
So is it your hunch that form followed function in terms of they had a small budget, so they'd kind of work with what they had, and hence we get the sets that look the way they do?
Well, I don't know really, because they obviously did want to paint on these jagged pieces of canvas and that kind of thing, but they might have looked a little smoother, a little less like canvas if they had had more money.
Well, I guess we can be appreciative maybe they didn't have more money, because I don't know if we would want to change anything about this movie, right? I mean, maybe lavish with a higher production value, bigger budget, it wouldn't have looked the same way, and history could be different.
Yeah.
All right, Kristin. Well, we're celebrating the 100th birthday of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and birthdays are all about presents, of course. Only it's the fans who continue to get the gifts. So what's your opinion? What is this film's greatest gift to viewers?
I go back to its entertainment value. I think people enjoy seeing it. It's still a good story told, and it's a pleasure to watch the actors, especially. I mean, some of these were some of the biggest stars of the period, and it's certainly interesting to me to see what expressionist acting was actually like, because we have so many photos of theater productions with expressionist actors, but we'll never see them moving around. And here in these films, we can do that. So it's a way of, looking into the past and seeing how a modernist style, which was very much widespread in Germany by the 20s, actually could be experienced by people, and how the actors performed in expressionistic ways.
Yeah, good point. What else? Are there any other gifts that stand out to you that keep on giving, if you will? How about the story?
Yeah.
Like, to me, the story remains impressive and not easily outguessed.
Mm-hmm.
The filmmakers, they do a really good job of thickening the plot, of covering their tracks well, using misdirection and preventing the viewer from easily predicting what will happen.
Mm-hmm.
So as example, instead of showing the killer outright, you show the killer's shadow without revealing his identity. And then you introduce the subplot about the criminal who's arrested and blamed for Cesare's murders, which makes us question who's committing the crime. It's simple and effective. And showing us what Francis sees, the apparent figure of Cesare sleeping in the box, causes us to wonder what's going on. How can he be at two places at the same time? In 1920, I'm sure audiences would have been more perplexed and less kind of cynical about that. But the disclosure of Caligari as the head of the asylum where Cesare, or someone who looks like him, is an inmate, that kind of pulls the rug out from under our collective feet. And then the concluding twist, it remains interesting and unexpected. To me, it's rare to see a 100-year-old silent film turn on a dime so quickly and shockingly by the denouement, when it's revealed that Francis is not to be trusted as a narrator and everything we've previously seen is now in doubt. So to me, it's the story that is one of its greatest gifts. And I mentioned some of the questions that it causes you to ask yourself by the conclusion. I want to bring some of these up to you, at least in my head. Caligari continues to be this thought-provoking and unsettling work that conjures up these queries. Like, is it possible that Francis was telling the truth about Caligari? Did Caligari have Francis committed to the asylum to conveniently shut Francis up and cast him as an unreliable witness?
Mm-hmm.
Who is the truly insane person? Is it Francis or Caligari? And who's crazier, the mad leader or the ones who follow him?
Mm-hmm.
Has Francis possibly committed the murders that he blames on Caligari and Cesare? How much of perceived reality can be trusted? How easy is it for the common person to fall under the spell of a Caligari, or for that matter, the government or its leaders? Again, all the delicious questions that you ponder in your mind. So it's more than just this simple, quickie, silent movie from a foreign country that, some filmmakers cop to. This is a real chunky plot story that has a delicious twist that raises questions. And to me, that's the mark of a really good movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has an ambiguity about it at the end that does allow you to think back over things that happen within the inner story and ponder them. And the fact that Francis's friend Alan is not one of the characters who shows up in the asylum.
Right.
That's been mentioned by at least one critic.
Yeah, is this all in his head? Is that an imaginary friend? What's going on?
Well, did he kill Alan? Is I think the implication.
Yeah, good point.
We can't know what the filmmakers actually intended, but it has the kind of ambiguity that we associate with later art films.
Yeah, definitely true.
Films that don't give you satisfactory endings.
Mm-hmm. No question. So, Kristin, do you think Caligari will still be widely watched and relevant in another 100 years? What do you think here?
Well, assuming we don't kill ourselves off.
Big assumption, but let's take it for granted for the moment.
Yeah, let's assume that at least some of us will be around in 100 years. I think the classics, the great artworks in any medium are lovingly preserved for the most part. We still go to museums to see Egyptian statues that are thousands of years old. And we put out enormous effort to find old artworks and restore them and put them in museums or whatever. So if we pay so much attention to artworks of the past, I think we're going to do the same with films of this period. the archival movement that's been going on for the last few decades has made it possible for us to see films that were long thought to be lost or long thought to survive only in really horrible prints. And then, archivists go to great lengths to put together the best prints into a new restoration. And so I think people want the art of the past. And Caligari is a proven classic. It's survived for 100 years. Why not 200? The fact that the anniversary is being celebrated. I just Googled Caligari 100 anniversary, and all these screenings that are going on around the world
Fantastic.
popped up. So people remember, and people still want to see this film. And I would assume that's going to keep up going.
It's not often we talk about a 100-year-old movie, right? I mean, so many of these films from the silent age and that period are gone, no longer with us. And thankfully we have, as we've talked about, a great print, great surviving elements, and a strong appreciation among modern generations to celebrate Caligari. So this is a rarity, and I'm in agreement with you. I'm confident and optimistic that this is going to be one that will not just be shown in film classes, but I think horror fans are always going to be intrigued about the earlier predecessors, the influences to some of their favorite movies. And if nothing else, it'll be a curiosity for some people, but it'll be around, assuming we're around as a species, right?
Yeah, and assuming that people keep migrating the digital prints onto the newer formats that come along, because on the one hand, the digital restoration that's been done allows us to copy and copy and copy, and it will always be that beautiful restoration. But, there are hundreds of thousands of films that, if we're to keep on being able to see them, are going to have to be updated at intervals.
No, it's going to be a perpetual
They're not
struggle.
going to be watching them on DVD.
Absolutely right. I mean, it's going to have to be a continued effort of love and care for some of these more neglected films, especially that are deserving of preservation. And we can only hope, right, Kristin?
We can, yes.
So I was going to ask you what you're currently working on that listeners should check out.
Well, David and I and our colleague Jeff Smith are currently revising our other textbook, Film History and Introduction, which should come out in its 5th edition next January.
Oh, terrific.
There's that, and we are, thanks to this new restoration, we're replacing our frame enlargement from Caligari with a better one. So that's Caligari's part in that.
There you go.
And then another thing that we're working on is something you may have heard of, the Criterion Channel streaming service.
Sure.
Started up last year, and we do a series for that channel called Observations on Film Arts. We and our colleague Jeff Smith do these little video essays, about 10, 15 minutes long.
Oh, cool.
On individual films that are streaming and will be streaming permanently on the channel. So we've done 34 of those are already up, and I did one on Picnic at Hanging Rock, which should go online in about 2 weeks. For example, I did one on flashbacks in Seastrom's The Phantom Carriage, which is already online, and that, by the way, is having its 100th anniversary next year.
Oh, you're right about that, yeah.
So those are the major projects I'm working on at the moment. The Criterion people are coming out next week to do some recordings for future video postings. So
I have yet to subscribe to their streaming service, but I continually collect and purchase so many of their Blu-rays and DVDs. It's only a matter of time, so I will definitely have to check that out. I hope that our listeners also investigate that on the Criterion channel. How exciting that is. It's fantastic. So you do this with your husband? Is he often on camera with you?
We do separate ones. So we're talking heads, but we take turns. We're going to be recording pieces on Ozu's Passing Fancy next week and Steve McQueen's Hunger, and I'm doing one on Lucretia Martel's La Cienega. So it's quite a varied batch of films.
Wow. A smattering of diverse features there, but it speaks to the tastes and eclectic interests of the Criterion Collection and its fans. So that sounds fantastic.
Yeah, we try to reflect both geographic and gender and et cetera aspects of the collection. It is fantastic to be working with those folks.
All right. Well, again, we want to thank you so much for appearing on Cineversary. We'll keep an eye out for the Criterion Channel and your other endeavors. And in the meantime, want to wish you a happy Valentine's Day and happy birthday to the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Yes, and thanks so much for having me on. I've enjoyed it.
How cool was that? My thanks again to cinema expert Kristin Thompson for dishing all those delicious details and opinions on the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's time now for another edition of Standing Ovations. This is where I give a shout out to a movie, book, website, TV program, podcast, or other work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers. So for February, the month of Valentine's Day, and which I recently learned is actually American Heart Month, it's only fitting that I confess my love for something special. And the podcast I'm about to plug is certainly that. It's The Secret History of Hollywood, written, narrated, and produced by Adam Roche, which published a 10-episode miniseries on the life and works of venerated RKO producer Val Lewton, the visionary responsible for turning the studio's fortunes around in the 1940s and whose unit created some of the finest works of classic horror cinema, including Cat People, I Walked with a Zombie, The Leopard Man, The Seventh Victim, and The Body Snatcher. Each episode in this miniseries is absolutely fantastic. Seriously, folks, meticulously crafted by Roche. He takes you into the private life of Lewton and the struggles he faced trying to turn low-budget B-pictures into art. Seriously, the quality of Roche's writing on this show alone elevates this to probably the best podcast series I've ever heard. He spent nearly 3 years releasing these episodes, some of which run over 4 hours long. If you're a fan of classic films, horror movies, and the golden age of Tinseltown, then you definitely want to check out The Secret History of Hollywood, available on all major podcast platforms. Okay, we've come to the end of yet another installment of Cineversary. I'd love to hear what you think of our show. You want to offer me some suggestions or comments, and you can reach me, Eric Martin, at cineversegroup@gmail.com, Cineverse group@gmail.com. I also encourage you to check out cineversegroup.com, which is the portal for my Cineverse film discussion group that I launched 14 years ago and which continues to meet weekly in the South Suburban Chicago area. Cineverse is a democratic film society that watches and then discusses a predetermined movie that our members pick on a rotating basis. At cineversegroup.com, you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the films we study. Also, little side note, instead of cluttering up our podcast with advertisements, nobody really wants to hear that stuff, we've decided to ask our listeners for their support directly. So we could use your help to offset the costs to produce Cineversary, which include expenses like podcast hosting provider fees. If you'd like to make a monetary contribution to the Cineversary podcast in any amount, large or small, we've made it safe and simple by partnering with PayPal to collect the funds. All you have to do is visit tinyurl.com/donate-cineversary and click on the Donate button. Any major credit card is accepted, and the entire transaction is handled securely and confidentially by PayPal, so no worries there. Or if you're familiar with PayPal already, you can simply send us a payment in any amount you want to Cineverse Group, Cineversegroup, @gmail.com. We really appreciate your generosity. Okay, still with me? I'll bet you want to know what we have planned for March. Well, next month, we'll infuse this show with some much-needed laughs as we celebrate the 40th anniversary of a movie considered to be one of the funniest ever made, Airplane, with an exclamation point at the end. And I'll be joined by two of my favorite fellow podcasters, Michael DiGiovanni and Adam Bloom, hosts of the Classic Film Jerks, a show I've appeared on previously, by the way. That should be a lot of fun, so I hope you'll check back in next month for what should be a wacky and whimsical installment of Cineversary. This has been your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and cherish those classic movies because, hint, 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 they're not getting older, they are just getting better. Thanks again for giving us a listen.